right, good evening. Friday evening today, Dr. Richards. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Dr. Leib?
Doing great. End of the week, so probably a little bit more energy now than it would be maybe on a Sunday morning.
Friday Night Lights right now.
Absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
you know what? I just realized that the movie, the Jordan movie Air, is on Prime Video. So I have my night planned after
I got
this.
I gotta watch that.
Yeah, and I'm super excited about that. I literally named my daughter after Michael Jordan, so that's my whole generation in one movie right there,
There you
played
go.
by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. So
It's gotta be good.
it's got to be
Gotta be
good.
good with that combo.
But I was shocked. It's they're not giving it away. I have Prime, but it's on Prime. Like I thought I was gonna have to wait until that came out of the theaters.
Have you heard anything about
I,
how
I
if it's good or
I
not?
heard it's just nothing but good. That's all I've heard. So
All
I'm
right.
super excited, and I can't see how I wouldn't love it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh well now, all right. Maybe that's what I'm doing.
that's your night too.
Yeah. Figured it out.
All right. Well, we'll dabble on the topic of grip strength a little bit, and then we'll get to that. So I did a little intro episode last week. I hope you had a good time at your wedding. Looks the Instagram pictures look like you had a good time.
It was fun. Yep.
We just talked about like what we're going to discuss probably this week and maybe next week when it comes to grip. So I'll let you lead off. How do you use grip in practice? How do you think about grip training in practice generally? And then you can give me some examples of what you use specifically.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is, I think there's been a lot of studies done kind of correlating grip strength to longevity
Mhm.
and healthy longevity, also upper body strength, just as a metric for looking at that. So how I use it in practice is honestly just as part of that. So sometimes, I mean, we can get specific with carries and things like that, but there's a lot of different ways to look at grip, whether it's the different types of grip that we can go over as we go through this episode, or hanging versus carrying something in different positions. Um, but generally, looking at grip as just a general um, indicator of upper body strength. And it may not give you the specifics as the overall, shoulder, elbow flexor, extensor strength, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of where someone's at. Um, in the past in school, we used to actually use like a metric where I forget what that it's a version of a handheld dynamometer,
Right.
but where you can actually measure grip strength, but haven't used that as much recently or anything. But I think subjectively being able or somewhat objectively being able to assess someone's strength in different positions is really important. And it's something that's always going to be included as part of a rehab program and overall training program, whether it's directly or indirectly. Um, I'll let you take it from there because you, I know, have a lot of thoughts on it. How do you use grip training in practice?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the handheld dynamometer because I think a lot of times that's what people think of when they think of grip strength. They think of like specifically you have to squeeze something and get a number on it, or those old stress balls, like something that you're doing where you're just gripping over and over again for reps. Where mentioning it as the foundation of upper body strength or upper body function, I think is really the best way to go. And although in research they often do use a hand dynamometer to get the
Yeah.
numbers, you listen to a lot of researchers and people that are scientists talk about it. That you're just saying, why do you think that shows up time and time again? And it's likely because it's just a really good marker of overall body strength, at least specific to the upper body, but I would say even full body. So I think it's important to bring that up, and then just thinking of it is like we could make it objective, but it doesn't have to be as specific as like squeezing something and getting a number, but looking at it as, okay, how heavy of a thing can you carry? And then, then we have to talk about, well, what type of grip are you going to carry that thing with? Right. So there's a lot of context whenever we start talking about grip. And I think that's important to think about. So, whatever is coming out in a scientific study, it's important to know that that's there. But then there's so much more we can break down as professionals that we could really make a whole full body workout just by keeping the grip in mind, which is pretty awesome when you actually start to think about it. And we will talk about that the next two episodes. But today, specifically, the movements in the gym that I think are the most worthwhile to talk about from a grip standpoint are things where you carry weights either at your sides or at different parts of your body in like rack style positions. And then hanging from a bar in some way, or you could be hanging from any implement, but hanging overhead, you can think of it as even hanging when your arms are behind you, where you have some type of grip on an implement and then your body is draping down in some direction while you're maintaining that grip. And that's going to start to link shoulder mobility with grip. So those two, if we can get them in people's workout programs, I find that a lot of good stuff happens right there. And then especially when we're looking at the carries, but even with the grips, like we can really, depending on the implement that you're lifting, you can be training so many different grips. So for instance, a classic one is a kettlebell grip. But how you grip a kettlebell can vary depending on what you want to focus on. So one of the concepts that I usually try to promote is this idea of grip layering when you're gripping a kettlebell, but then with as many implements as you can. And the kettlebell is one of the easiest because it's this cylindrical grip. So the idea of grip layering would be to start the grip close to the wrist, right? So if you think about it, if you were just going to grab something and be lazy with your grip, you'd probably just hook it on your fingers and just sort of like let it hang out there. So imagine you're carrying a kettlebell at your side and the kettlebell is just hanging at your fingers. So we would call that like a curled finger grip. But that to me is like the last grip that you want to be able to do because it's sort of the last resort. You have no other option after that. But if you grasp an object or a kettlebell by getting it really close to the wrist, almost like you're curling your wrist at first, and you're just going to hook it in the low part of the meat of your hand. Now, you're not going to have a lot of endurance there, but it's a starting point that you've just got more of your forearm working, more of your wrist working. Now, when that gets tired, then what you can do is let that bell slip down and just crush it in the palm. Now your wrist is a little bit more neutral and you can hang out there. And as you're going through these different grip layers, you're also getting different muscle activations up the chain. Different parts of your wrist and forearm are being balanced out in a way. So you're getting just a little bit more of a full upper body endeavor by doing that, but it's going to give you more time to be able to hold on to that bell too, because once you get tired in that crush grip, then you can let it slip down into the fingers and finish with that curled finger grip. So that's something I like to promote for people. And one of the reasons I started doing that is because I noticed with higher level strength endeavors, like in gymnastics, or even just like holding on to barbells, when you wanted to activate more of your upper body, so you're holding on to a barbell that's about to do a deadlift, or even just grabbing a barbell and putting it on your back during a back squat, that there was this idea of if I had my fingers touching the bar, I was loose in the wrist, I was weak in the wrist, so I was basically losing some tension through the chain. I wasn't as strong. It was very obvious. So then starting to think about that as, all right, I'm going to be stronger if I get my contacts a little bit closer, a little bit more proximal, closer to my wrist, closer to my elbow. But I'm also going to be able to create a lot of tension there. I might not have as much endurance. So that there's this, depending on what the intention is, go through a layering process and you can get more strength or more endurance, but you're also going to be balancing out the grip a little bit more.
I like the idea too, just that you're generally looking at grip endurance, because like you said, like the handheld dynamometer is used a lot in studies, and
Right.
that's going to measure max strength more so than, I mean, you can look at repeated strength, but the idea of endurance and actually letting your grip change depending on the context. So like you were saying, you create more proximal stability with it, higher up in your palm, more closer to the wrist. When's the time that you would want to use a grip maybe further down from the fingers? Or is it, you're saying, just kind of always like, you're going to start closer and it'll generally gradually kind of get further away, further distal?
Ideally, I'd like people to grasp the object closer to their wrist, and they may not be able to spend much time there, but I just want people to get in that habit. Right, because the default is to never even think about that. Right, is just to pick something up as loose as you can, and then what happens is people don't feel as strong as they are. Right, so if you give somebody an object and they carry it really loosely, they're like, oh, this is heavy, until you actually like really prepare your body for it, and then you start to realize it's like, okay, I'm owning this thing right now. I really have it, and that's not something that you can teach someone right away, but it is the setup for any type of strength endeavor is really important, as you know, right? Like, and if you really think about the powerlifting, like the idea is where you have one rep of something, right? So much of that rep is the setup before the actual action, right? That's what would make somebody strong. Or even if you're doing like a shot put endeavor, right? Like how you set up before you actually release the implement is just as important as the release, right? So you have to really understand the setup. So to me, when you're gripping something or where you're bringing your hand onto something, and we could talk about like even putting your hands on the ground when you're about to do a push-up, is how you make contact with the ground or a couple with the implement. To me, it makes a lot of difference. So I'm always trying to teach that as sort of a standard foundation. But then, yeah, it really does depend on the intent. If I'm going to have somebody say carry something for 2 minutes because I'm just having them really focus on endurance, I'm going to let them sneak down into the fingers pretty quickly. I might even have them be able to pass the bell side to side. There's going to be a lot less focus on like a rigid type of posture. It's just going to be on, okay, like just don't drop this thing. All right. But it actually should improve endurance just because you're kind of working different anatomy and you're going through layers of anatomy, and then you're still left with the thing that you were going to use in the first place, but you kind of got to gas through some of the other things first. So it gives you a little bit more strength work. You're building endurance in those areas, although the endurance might be less so. And then you're eventually going to end up where you were going to start anyway. So yeah, I'll teach it in that sequence.
I think it's cool to look at, you're talking about variability of grip in that sense of a carry, but also thinking about whether you're performing like a somewhat more cyclical or repetitive activity where, I guess not cyclical, but looking at like a kettlebell snatch or kettlebell swing, or even like a barbell clean, where your grip is actually changing back and forth to a certain extent as you go. And you kind of have to learn how to create tension in the right amount.
Yeah.
So that, if you're doing a kettlebell swing and you're doing, say, 100 reps or whatever it is, or you're doing the 5-minute snatch test, you can't just crush it right off the bat, or else you're just your forearms will give out. So I think there's another skill to it too, in addition to endurance and strength, the skill of learning how to essentially grip optimally to match the demands of the task.
So I was going to save that for next week's conversation, but I refer to that as a reactive grip. And in my book, chapter 14, I talk all about grip strength and longevity through movement. So I did break it down into, carries, overhead hanging, and then lifting from the ground. And then the last category was ballistic swinging movements, which work best, in my opinion, or my experience with a kettlebell. But you really could use any implement as long as you can get this idea of your grip has to be reactive to the movement, right? Like if you over squeeze it, you're going to lose the velocity of the movement, and the velocity is absolutely mandatory to make that movement work, right? So you can basically, you only want to grip it as tight as you need to grip it, not to lose it. But you do enough volume there, that's absolutely going to tax your grip, and it'll tax it in different ways. Like you're going to feel your hand to be tired afterwards, but a lot of times it is more of this finger strength. But in my experience with like kettlebell snatching, like the heavier I go, there's always this point where if I'm doing a new weight, I don't feel as comfortable having the weight as far down on my hand. So I have to get the bell a little bit higher in the palm, and it creates this little abrasiveness, right? Like that is obviously me being inefficient in that moment because the weight is new, but it's sort of like where I have to be first to be more confident in the grip. I can't over squeeze it, but I do feel like I have to have more of my palm on the weight when I'm in heavier weights or loads that my body's not as comfortable with. And it's a cool process that as I get more comfortable with a weight that used to be heavy and now it becomes more like a moderate weight, I'm more comfortable letting it go into my fingers down farther into the hand and able to ballistically move it and flow with it. So even that with those type of movements, there is this sense of layering that you have to think about. It just might not be as obvious. Like the setup's not going to be probably as deep, as close to the wrist when we're moving with velocity versus if it's just a static hold. But I do think the analogy and the sequencing still holds. It's just you might not teach it the same way.
Right. Are you using a similar setup to carries, in terms of the layering that you are for hanging? type variations?
Yeah, a lot of time. And one of the places I remember learning about just changing the grip was when I started learning like kippings and things like that in CrossFit, but not learning it from like a kipping pull-up perspective, but an actual like straightforward gymnastic perspective, and how to grip the bar. And that like totally changed things for me. I remember getting a lot of like shoulder issues. And it's not that I never get them anymore, but it was very obvious that if I grip the bar differently, I was able to just feel like I was more in control of my whole system, for lack of it. Like I didn't feel like my shoulder was a separate entity from my center, right? And as soon as I started to grip a little bit differently, and I did things like put torque on the bar with a different grip, I just felt like I was much more connected from my grip to my shoulders, right down through my core, or whatever term you want to use, through my midline. But it definitely felt like more of a unit. So, and that was definitely more of like towards the pinky side, towards the wrist type of grip, compared to what I was doing was just hanging on the fingers as much as I can. And definitely there's a similar process that if you were going to do enough pull-ups, I think it's useful to start with as much of your palm crushing that bar as you can, or even if you have the wrist mobility and the forearm strength to get even a little bit of flex in the wrist at first. Start there, because you're going to fall, right? Gravity is going to pull you down, and when it pulls you down, you're going to pull towards your fingers. So don't start there, start a little bit higher, and then as you're doing more reps, allow yourself to move to the fingers, and you're like, okay, I'm at my fingers now. I did 5 pull-ups on my palm, right? Now I can do the rest on my fingers or something like that. You can actually start to train that in your own head when you're starting to train for more pull-ups. I can now do 10 pull-ups in my palm. Now, when I'm getting to 10 plus, I have to finish the rest of them on my fingers, right? So it becomes like just a different way to think about how you're building and stacking pull-ups.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention too, you distribute the actual like physical stress on the skin so that maybe you're not getting calloused as bad in the same spot.
Well, you're getting them in just different places. Like you get them in the middle of your hand, you get them on the like
just get all over.
MP joint. Yeah, you get them all over, but it's not like always on the same spot, like you said. But so you do want to find calluses throughout your hand, because like a callus, I always tell people is good. The going beyond that then becomes the blister, that you always have to play that game of like you don't want to get into the blister. But callousing is like a form of conditioning for your skin, really. So like noticing where you're getting your calluses can really change like your ability to build a grip and be more confident in gripping in different parts of your hand.
Yeah, and like I guess a little bit talking about that and looking at my own hands, but you've talked to me before about this idea of hand quadrants.
Yeah.
And I kind of hear a little bit of that, when you're talking about gripping more towards the pinky side with, higher up in the palm potentially. Can you talk a little bit more about what the hand quadrants are and, how you kind of assess that? Because I know people probably tend to talk about it in feet a little bit more. But I think it's something that's undervalued in terms of looking at it in the upper body.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost an identical parallel to the feet. So if you're thinking about the quadrants in the feet, you have the 4 corners of the feet, 2 in the front and the ball of the foot, 2 in both sides of the heel. So the more you're back towards the heel, which you could be thinking of the heel of the hand, you're going to tend to be a little bit more biased towards supination. We can use that term, or external rotation. Like all these terms can sort of be used synonymously, but if we start to move even more so towards like the pinky side, so pinky toe, pinky side of the hand, or the ulnar side, that would even bias you a little bit more towards that external rotation, supination type of idea. And then going towards the thumb side, you're more towards pronation, but you're still like less towards pronation than you would be if you went to like the index finger, which would be the parallel to the big toe in the foot. So your kind of maximal idea of pronation or internal rotation would be going towards the big toe, index finger, knuckle area there of the hand, and the maximal supination, external rotation idea would be more towards the ulnar side of the wrist part of the hand. So, and that really helps when you're starting to think about either shoulder symptoms they have to work around, or just directions that you might want to bias, right? And that could become a really detailed conversation. But a lot of times it's not a hard cue to give to a client. So if I know as a clinician what they need, and they're holding on to a bar, they're going to do a pull-up or during a bar hang, and they're getting a symptom, say on the right shoulder, and I know they need a little bit of internal rotation on that shoulder, what I might give them a cue for is a little bit heavier on the pinky side of your left hand, closer to the wrist, so that it moves them a little bit off of their right and a little bit heavier into the thumb side of their right hand, almost like a push-pull to the left, and make it as subtle as you need to not be in pain. But something as simple as that, just using these hand quadrants as a way to shift people subtly while they're still doing the exact exercise they want to do, can make a lot of difference with changing symptoms. And sometimes that just becomes, that's your, what you used to think was straight, that's your straight, that's your symmetrical, right? Yeah. Because, you know, we're right-handed, we're left-handed, we're not symmetrical beings. We can have a whole podcast on that conversation, but we know that, and people know that, like intuitively, when you just break it down and just say like, hey, are you right-handed or left-handed, right? Like you're not supposed to be completely straight. So maybe that's just your cue. And maybe if you're having shoulder pain there, that's because your body needed a different cue to do the same activity. The key is you can't make it feel like too much of a different activity, right? Like if it's a pull-up and you give somebody a band, well, that's, maybe you need to do that to teach them the essence of it, but the more subtle it can be and the more it stays into the same exercise, then it becomes better for them and they're still getting stronger at the same time.
It's a lesson for rehab and in general is
exactly
that I feel like the less you can take people out of the thing, the better.
Absolutely. Yep. Starting at the finish. That's a Charlie Weingroff idea. I don't know if he talks about it the same way, but I always like that terminology from his work, because it makes complete sense. Like, don't like try to break it down into all bit parts and never put the puzzle back together again. I feel like that's what a lot of physical therapy is. It's like you have an idea, like someone came in complaining of one thing and then you just put them on a table that looks nothing like the thing that they're complaining of. Maybe you have to get back there, but reverse engineer your process far enough to get back there, as opposed to just assuming, all right, like, well, I'm going to work every muscle and I'm going to have them do it on their back.
Yeah. Gotta connect the dots there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You go.
I was saying, any other, so the idea of loaded carries, I think, have become pretty popular in the fitness world. I know you have a younger population than I tend to do. Are you using those a lot in your general like strength and conditioning work, like personally and with some of your athletes?
Yeah, we use it honestly a lot. Like with most people, some type of carry is going to be in their program. I mean, especially if they're like a fitness first person, but typically it's getting in there at some point for someone who's kind of coming in initially for, some type of rehab. But yeah, we'll use a variation of carries. I mean, starting with as simple as like a farmer's carry or single arm farmer's carry, and can play around with, like we touched on earlier, the idea of just more strength based, versus potentially more endurance. So changing the duration or distance that someone's holding or carrying something, will change kind of the intent of that. And then, we'll play around with a lot of different arm angles. So it's going to be a different grip challenge, potentially, I guess, overall easier, but you're not going to be using as much load, like in a 90-90 position or something like that, or even overhead for someone, which honestly might end up challenging a little bit more shoulder range of motion and anterior core control. But those are just like some big ones that I feel like we're programming the most. But I know you get pretty creative in terms of how you're using it with your population. What are you doing on a daily basis with it?
I mean, I don't know if creative is the right word, but it's just because it ends up being pretty simple. But I do make it a foundation of what I do for most clients pretty early, because I find that even with those that are brand new to exercise, a carry is a lot easier and safer for people than doing some type of press or pull. Although those can be completely safe early on, but it's just like there's actually more joint motion involved in a press or pull. So you can go typically heavier with people quicker when you're doing a carry, and this is where I think the idea of grip strength and grip training as a broad category is very valuable. Instead of having to train every muscle in the upper body, just think like, am I taxing the grip? Am I challenging the grip, and in how many ways? And as you do that, you might start to pull, might look like pull-ups. It might look like even like heavy press work and stuff like that. But for people that don't need to, or they feel unsafe moving their shoulders, moving their elbows too much, just get them doing heavy carries over time. It's such a good foundation and starting point. You see so much there. So if you're doing a single arm carry versus a double arm carry, you get to also see a lot with postural control, right? Mm-hmm. I like to think of, and this is my selling point sometimes for people that are like, why are you having me carry this weight? I'm like, it's a standing side plank. When I have somebody just do it with one hand, because if somebody keeps their posture alignment while they're holding a progressively or heavier weight, they're going to have to use the other side of their body not to lose that posture. And that what are you trying to do when you're doing a side plank, right? Like, you're just trying not to collapse. You're trying to use your bottom side abs typically to lift you, but you're also just trying to stabilize your position, biasing one side versus the other. So I like the farmer carry better than the side plank, let's put it that way, because it has a grip element to it. And most people that I see have a hard time at first doing a side plank well without feeling in their shoulder too much. So it's like, okay, this is sort of the opposite load on your shoulder if you can get that right. Yeah. But that becomes a selling point, because sometimes just, people need to feel things, and I'm not going to give them the heaviest weight right away because they'll feel it too much, and they're not going to feel that is safe. So oftentimes I'm gradually building up weight in a manner that almost the weight feels too light. I'm just like, just enjoy that for this week, and then we'll do a little bit more next week, and then gradually building up each increment of kettlebell that I have in the gym. That's typically a foundation of almost all of my clients' routines, because I just think it's so simple to get people to feel weight. And you don't always have to walk either, right? Like, so I wrote this actually in my book, is it's a hold to a carry. The carry is not, it's not like walking normally. To me, it's just dynamic standing, right? Like, you've owned the standing position. You just add a little bit of footsteps forward, backward, side to side, and see what happens when you go and add that dynamic element. Do you lose the posture? Does it, just really knock you out of position? And sometimes that's fine, but it's just, is it safe enough? Is it worth that fight, or do you just want to stand still there? So yeah, I don't know, creative is the word, but it's certainly like a foundation, and it becomes maybe creative in how I get people to do it. That's about it.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. I hear you. I would say creative in comparison to, well, more thoughtful. Yeah. More foundational.
All right. Yeah. Certainly foundational is something that's becoming. We've talked about this before with I took a course years ago, the fundamental capacity screen. So long ago, I actually forget the name. I know it was FCS. But it was through the people who did the FMS, and then this was sort of their spin-off, talking about looking at elements of fitness, and they had like 4 categories in that, and one of them was motor control. The second one was postural control. So their big assessment for postural control was a loaded carry that for time, and just seeing like when you lost your posture, how long you can hold it for. So they had some metrics within that actually got me started to think like, oh, that's kind of a cool thing to look at, because we know that grip strength's important, but I never really thought about it as like, you could have your own system of like when people lose posture and how you define that, right? Like, and it's not about it being like, oh, that's a good posture or bad posture. It's about a loss of posture, which means you have to have a starting point, a standard in your head, and say, okay, that's what they are. That's what they're starting. Here's where they lose it, right? And maybe you allow them to lose it. So the idea of grip layering is kind of a loss of posture, but maybe it's an acceptable loss of posture. So if you teach that, if you teach the idea of like, start in your up high in your palm, let it slip to your palm, crush it there for a little bit, then let it slip to your fingers, try to maintain, the rest of your shape, head over shoulders over hips, or whatever cue you want to give. If that is what you're teaching, then there's a purposeful loss of posture to allow them to do more. Right. So there's a postural variability that can be, you knowing that you're going to have to lose posture eventually, then you actually have some control over it.
I love that take.
So I guess the last thing I was going to mention or ask you about is the hangs and overhead hanging. And I know I've been doing a lot more of that ever since I got into some gymnastics training. How are you using that with your clients? Any insight for me there?
I actually was looking at it pretty specifically with someone like a couple weeks ago. I had someone come in with they had a nerve issue going down their hand,
Hmm.
lost motor control for a certain period of time, and they were kind of gaining it back, and was just looking at very non-specifically, just trying to see if they could get into a hanging position with more of a pronated grip. And also, like, occasionally we'll use a single arm hang just as kind of an idea and a test of where they're at from a single upper extremity strength and control standpoint, as well as like ability to kind of manage the rest of your torso and body. Um, but that's a pretty heavy endeavor. So that's more so
Hmm.
like they can get it into it. That's great, but I'm typically not looking at that as like a staple. But typically just looking at a normal hang like you would think of the bottom of a pull-up position, but usually trying to actually cue it so that we're getting some muscular tension throughout the body. Um, Typically like getting into some sort of hollow position, and then
Hmm.
playing a little bit with grip in terms of, pronated palm away versus supinated palm towards you, to potentially change range of motion to a certain joint or just shift tension throughout the upper body. So if someone's painful, doing say a pull up or even just like an overhead hang or overhand pronated grip hang, maybe playing around with grip to getting to more of a neutral grip position, palms facing each other, or even supinated, and seeing just how that changes it. Um, just trying to stay curious with that for the most part initially, and then based off what we see, kind of program out from there. But what about yourself?
I'm glad you brought up the hollow body because I also look at the overhead position sort of as this same idea of an assessment of postural loss. And one of the ways that I guess one of the prerequisites you need for that is to make sure that you don't make it too hard too soon.
Yep.
So working on that hollow body. So it's something that people may know that as like it's just a gymnastic position. It's sort of like a foundational gymnastic position that you could teach it. Oftentimes it gets taught in supine before anything, but you could just take that shape and now hang on a bar and try to teach the same thing. But what I found is, especially in some people that are newer to fitness, is any type of lifting of the feet off the ground and just like free hanging is way too hard, right?
Yep.
They could do it without getting hurt, but there's really no value there that I can give them other than just say like, all right, be able to do that longer.
Yeah.
But one of the values I found is that to think of that hollow shape as the foundation, but you have to keep the feet on the ground first. So, the markers of control that I tend to look for is start with this grip in the palm, at least in the palm, maybe even start a little bit lower towards the wrist, but like keep it in the palm as long as you can. And just wherever you're starting, just make sure you know that that's your starting point with your grip. So any slippage or loss of the grip, you have to reset the postural cues because now you're losing your shoulder control, you're losing your grip control. So we start with the grip control somewhere in the palm. And then we have the cue of making sure that wherever the shoulders are relative to the ears, they stay put there. So generally you don't want the shoulders moving up towards the ears, or again, you've lost your control of your hang. So if we're thinking of from a hollow hang, you'll have an anchor of your hands on the bar, but your body's not going to really drop in a manner that your shoulders would get closer to your ears. So we have to keep that in mind because a lot of times if you just let people free hang, that's the first thing you're going to see. They'll slip to their fingers, shoulders start to come up closer to the ears, right? So we want to keep that space and then think of the cue is actually going to be the front of the ribs down as opposed to pulling the shoulder blades down, which a lot of people will want to pull the shoulder blades down when you cue them to not have their shoulders go by their ears. So it's really not a shoulder blade cue, but just as the rib cage comes down and stays down, and you're able to keep the hollow down lower with the pelvis being slightly tucked and getting some hip extension involved, that will keep your shoulders down. So if you get the grip right, you get the core position and the hip position right, your shoulders will just be where they need to be. So it's a sign of a loss of control. If they go up, you've lost some of those cues there. But a lot of times people again need to start with foot contact and be able to engage all of those actions So I'll take people through a sequence of whole foot contact to ball of the foot contact to tippy toe contact, and just in each of those contact points, making sure, all right, do you still feel your grip contact? Have you lost your shoulders at all? Do you have your ribs down position where you want? Can you feel, basically that's going to be your abs cue. And then do you feel some type of hamstring, inner thigh, like hip extenders? So because it's this opposite of the anterior pelvic tilt that you're really trying to fight for. So you have some type of trunk flexion from the abs, and then you have some type of hip extension down lower. So you're just trying to fight for those cues. All right, you have all of those. Now, can you float one foot? Put that down. Can you float the other foot? Good, you got that. Can you float both feet? And do you sway like crazy? Do you lose all your posture? So it becomes a game of assessing postural control. Now, that can be really tedious for some people. So believe me, I let go of some of the discipline there. But as an assessment process, it's vital just to know. It's like, well, if somebody's hurting in any one of those, that's why, because they don't have the control of it, right? But you also know exactly where to turn down the knob, right? Okay, they started hurting, they got a shoulder pain. As soon as that foot came off, the ground, all right, let's put it back on there. We got to work on tippy toe contact for a little bit, because that's when the pain goes away, right? So it is this epitome of the movement continuum right there with the overhead hang. And it's, when you train things like, and I'm nowhere near getting there, but just going through the process of training for like a front lever or any of those motions where you're starting from a bar hang and your body over time gets lighter. Like you feel like you have your grip really anchored, you start to get into your lats, your core, your body just almost starts to float up. And it's such a cool feeling that it's very obvious when you get that right, when you get everything connected. But you can't do that until you're ready for it. And you usually have to be able to, make it easier before you make it harder. So that the overhead hang becomes a foundation of that, at least for me. And you could do that with your arms in different positions. So sometimes I'll have people with their hands behind their back and do a similar process where their hands are on rings, right? And they're in this close to like a back lever position, hands behind and a shoulder extension. And then they can have their feet on the ground, working almost towards like a skin the cat or some type of supported German hang. You can kind of work on something similar there. That tends to be a little bit more advanced in my experience, because they're more restricted there than they even know. And there's a lot more strength that just to even be able to come in and out of that. But there's ways to at least breach the subject with people. And most of the time it's, you have to keep the feet on the ground. It's not a dead hang, but it's more of like an incline. You're just letting gravity kind of make you slump a little bit in front of the line of gravity.
Yeah, it's funny. I was literally doing hollow hangs earlier today and just playing around with like feet on versus feet off, and I can keep a hollow, but the actual sensation of like intensity of sensation that you feel in your abs and hip extensors just immediately goes up when I actually put my feet on the ground, just because you're giving yourself more reference for what's going on. Or that's part of it at least. And like you said, like it's allowing you to better maintain postural control. But it was just interesting to me how it was like an instant change. Like put tiptoes down and all of a sudden it's like things just turned up. Honestly, the volume knob turned up way more in terms of what I was actually feeling, while also probably having less load throughout the grip and then upper body as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the last things we'll bring up, especially for, you're bigger than me, right? Like you're taller, you have a lot more weight on you. So from a body weight training standpoint, and overhead hanging fits into that, it's often alarming, like when strong people have to make it that easy for themselves, but they actually get so much more out of it, because you're sort of used to being able to, I can muscle my way through this, and you can, right? But you're not going to be able to do the same movement that carries over to the harder gymnastic movements, because there's this connection that actually can't be felt if you just allow like the muscles that are already strong to engage. It really is this, like these tiny little muscles, which they're always working and always there, but it's really about creating a direction in your joints that can't be created unless you make it easy enough for you to, basically direct your body in that way. So it's going to be compensation all day for a lot of people. So that's where it's like, it's really tricky, I think, to teach some of these gymnastic movements because it's hard to keep people patient until you get that sensation that you just talked about right there, where it's like, oh yeah, this is actually harder in a different way, right? So you can't make it too easy, you can't make it too hard. It's tricky to find that sweet spot.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there is a way to kind of do both simultaneously. Like if
Absolutely.
you're having two types of positions in training, one's more like the upper end of the spectrum where you're really fighting to maintain postural control, and the other is like, okay, I can hang out here for a while, but I can really feel things as I go. And probably having both at the same time almost enhances the harder one.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I put a different at one more hang in my book because I wanted to allude to the fact that like the hanging hollow is just one way to hang. And I find it to be quite useful from a standpoint of connection. Like it really, you do feel like you're sort of connected from head to toes. But the other one is like, you can think of it as like a bodybuilding style pull-up that you've seen before, or where you're actually biasing more of the extension side of the posture and trying to engage hip extension, maybe a little bit of lumbar extension with core bracing while you're locking the lats in. Right. So that there's other ways that you can train bar hanging. There's not one way. But I think one of the important things is like when you have a standard for the position you're trying to attain. And usually there's some type of idea that you don't want to let your shoulders just fall into, like you don't want to let your like gravity win. Right. So if you're trying to pull yourself into a more extended position, well, there's muscles involved with that you're trying to activate and connect and have work together, right? If you're trying to hollow yourself, that might change your shape a little bit more towards flexion, and there's still muscles that are involved in that you have to be able to maintain and coordinate, right? So it's never just like the easiest path. And I think that's what's important, because a lot of times the easiest path for people will be some type of idea where they have to use like the upper traps a little bit too much, or I hate using like a specific muscle, but just the idea of like the scapulas have to elevate because there's a lot of strength up there, but it's not something that they need to work because it's already a pattern that's there for them, right? So it's trying to show, where loss of posture happens, but you have to sort of choose your standard for that loss of posture first.
Yep. Another good lesson for life there.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, good. I think we went over what we wanted to, but I thought like we got into some good topics there. So next week I'd like to touch a little deeper on just like deadlifts and different styles of lifting from the ground. So part of that can be any type of Olympic lifting as well, kettlebell type of work. We'll dive back into the conversation about like ballistic swinging, reactive gripping, but just thinking about, I think that gets underestimated, and I mentioned that before about this idea of like lifting from the ground, like doing a deadlift or something, like how much the grip really matters there. And even like stuff where it's not as necessary, like a back squat. If you want to be really, really strong, your grip is involved in anything. Your grip is this sort of, it's this charger. I like to think if you get your grip stronger, you can use it even if you're quote unquote using your legs to charge up the whole movement, right? Like, because it revs up your whole nervous system. And that's where, again, I think it shows up time and time again in the longevity research, because it's just a marker of people are just stronger, right? So it's sort of likely a healthy user bias, but our job is to make people healthier users so that if they were to be tested in these studies, they would have better numbers.
Yep. Awesome. Well, can't wait for that.
Likewise. Well, I'll see you next week.
All right. See you then.
Later.